RC from the Mountaintop Joiner Shop here. I just finished gluing up this walnut panel. It turned out real nice. The seam is pretty much invisible, it's nice and flat. And what I'm going to be doing is using this as a drawer bottom. And I'm going to be raising the panel to fit into the drawer groove a little bit better. So that's what I'm going to be showing you today. I didn't really plan on making a video this week about this subject, but it came up. I'm going to show you how I raise this panel with hand planes and actually add a little extra step at the end to help it fit into the groove a little more cleanly, which you can take or leave. Yeah, that's kind of what we're up to. So first things first though, I should explain why you would want to raise a panel in the first place. What are the advantages of doing so? So let's hop to it. Okay, so what is a raised panel? It's kind of a misnomer of a term in my opinion, because they call it a raised panel because it means that the middle of the panel looks like it's raised from the edges. But when you're actually creating a raised panel, you're not raising the middle at all. You're just removing material around the edges. And the reason you're doing that is, you'll notice here that I have my groove in the drawer. It's about 7 mil if I recall correctly, and that this panel is much too thick to fit into that groove. So that's the obvious reason that you would raise a panel. You're thinning 3 sides of the edges of the drawer bottom in order to fit into that groove better. And that precipitates the question, well, why don't you just use a thinner panel to begin with and you won't have to raise it at all? Well, the reason for that is, especially with a drawer that's as big as this one, is if you use a really thin panel in it and put a lot of weight in that drawer, the panel is likely to sag in the middle, which is no bueno. That is kind of the main impetus for going through the effort of raising a panel, but it also gives it a nice traditional look as well. So because this is a solid wood panel and not a manufactured one, I do want to use a little bit thicker material so it doesn't sag. So I'm going to raise it with some hand planes and make sure that it fits into that groove okay. So like with anything in hand tool woodworking, it starts with marking out where all of your cuts and joinery and hand planing are going to occur. So I'm going to be raising this side of this panel. I took a look at it, and this side's nice and clean, and this side has a little bit of tear out on it from where I hand planed everything flush after the glue up. And so it makes sense to me to make that the bottom of my drawer bottom. So this is where my bevels are going to go, and I'm making this edge the front of the drawer bottom because the grain isn't really working against me as much as it is on the other side. So I'm going to be doing these 3 edges, and I need to mark them out. The first thing I'm going to do is mark out the edges where they're going to be thinned to fit into the drawer groove, and that should be done with a wheel gauge or a marking gauge and should be equal to the width of the drawer groove in the drawer sides. So in my case that's 7 millimeters, and I'm going to mark that from the inside face of my drawer bottom. So go ahead and mark that right there. Of course, on the end grain, it's nice and easy to see. When it comes to the orientation of the drawer bottom, it's traditionally done such that the end grain of the drawer bottom panel faces the drawer sides, and that gives room for the panel to expand and contract with seasonal moisture changes out the back of the drawer. So the end grain is going to be the sides, and one long grain side is going to be the front in this case. Go ahead and mark this out. And it's a little bit awkward because I'm trying to do it facing the camera, but so that's going to be where my 7 mil edge is going to be, and I'm going to make it nice and deep. And I'll do the other side. And of course, on the end grain, that gauge line shows up really well. And because this is going to be fit into a groove later, it doesn't really matter if you can still see that gauge line after everything's cut. Whereas if this is going to be something that's going to show later, I wouldn't do this with a marking gauge, I would do it with a pencil. Having just said that, when I raise this panel, I don't want to have any marking gauge lines at the edges of my bevels. I want that nice and clean. So rather than do that with a marking gauge, I'm going to do that with essentially a panel gauge. This one's, to my mind, a small panel gauge. This is the Incra T rule, and this works with a 5 millimeter mechanical pencil. What I do is basically find the hole that corresponds to the distance I want to mark my workpiece and stick my pencil lead into it, and it works just like a panel gauge that way. So I'm going to do about 5 centimeters here, like that. Let's go back the other way. all the way out to the edge. Where's the front again? There it is. Let's go all the way out the back. So I've often spoken of this little T-rule as the unsung hero of my shop. I freaking love this thing. I use it all the time. And for operations like this, it is just perfect. Just lovely. Let's get out to the edge. I have both sides of this blade to work with. I can use the 5 centimeter hole on this edge or this edge in order to kind of reach to the end here. One more side. And the reason I picked 5 centimeters to do this is that it's just slightly narrower than the width of my hand plane blade. So this is my joiner plane, and the blade on this is just a little bit wider than 5 centimeters. So it's nice to make your bevels just slightly narrower than the width of your hand plane blade. That said, I might actually use my jack plane for this. I haven't really decided yet. I might try one and see how it goes, and if it's not really doing the work the way I hoped it would, I might switch and try the other plane. But when I cut these bevels on the end grain edges of the drawer bottom, I'm not usually cutting straight across it. I'm kind of skewing the blade a little bit, and that's one case where the jack plane is kind of nice because it's not so long. So there's my marks. I have my edges and the tops, and basically I just need to remove all the material between my pencil line here and my marking gauge line here to create that raised bevel. So I'm going to try to immobilize this and get ready to cut the end grain bevels first, because when I do that, it might blow out the far end of the panel, and that will get cleaned up later when I do the long grain side. That's the plan. Okay, so before I can plane this, I need to immobilize the workpiece. So I like to use these Veritas planing stops. These have these kind of plugs on them that can be moved up and down the length of the stop. And the stop itself is like a soft aluminum, so if you accidentally bash into it with your hand plane, like you'll notice I've done many times here, because I've had these for over a decade, it won't damage the body of the hand plane at all. It'll just damage the planing stop itself. So I'm going to put one stop here, and this is a little bit back from where my leg vise is, because when I go off the end of this panel, I don't want to be bashing the toe of my hand plane into my vise chop and damaging that. So, and then I'm going to put another stop back here. It's a big long one, but you'll notice when I slide it back, I'm not really overhanging my edge here, and I would like to do that so I don't accidentally plane the edge of my bench. So I'm going to stick a little spacer back here. You know, there's always bits of offcuts you can use for this in different widths, so I usually just walk around until I find one that's a width that I like, and that gets me a little bit of edge overhang. And to make sure it doesn't move at all, I'm going to put a big old holdfast in the middle here. My holdfast, these are the Gramercy Tools holdfast. I put pieces of bicycle inner tube over the ends of them, and that gives it a nice rubbery grip. That said, that rubbery grip can leave a little bit of a black mark on your workpieces. And so if you don't want it to do that, usually just put a little wooden shim underneath it like that. So the rubber provides a lot of grip, and then the wood kind of provides a little bit of protection. So there we go. I'm nice and solid. So there we go. I'm now ready to plane all the material in between this pencil line and this marking gauge line on the edge here. And I'm going to start out using my jointer plane since it was already sitting on the bench. May as well start with that and see how it goes. But I might be inclined to switch to my jack plane if this isn't working to my satisfaction. So I'm planing the end grain bevel first, like I said earlier, and then I'll be able to clean that up when I plane the long grain edge later on. That said, the other side might not work out quite that same way, so we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Let's go ahead and start planing, and you'll notice that instead of going straight across, which can cause a little bit more tear out on the end, or a little bit blowout of the fibers on the end, I'm skewing a little bit. So that's one technique you can use if you're getting too much splintering out at the far end. But I'm going to go straight across right now because I find that a little bit easier. And if this starts to get a little bit too bad on this edge here, especially as I get closer to my marking gauge line, then I'll start to plane with more of a skew when I get down there. And I'm just angling the plane at an angle that I think matches this angle to the best of my abilities, but as I get closer to my lines, it'll be more apparent which way I need to kind of tilt the plane in order to reach those lines simultaneously and get that perfect angle all the way around. And I'm just watching where I've planed here to see how wide that bevel is, and that'll show me where I need to concentrate a little more in my effort so I can keep it even all the way across. So far I'm not getting much splintering out this way at all, so I'm going to keep pointing my plane straight down the line. It's not even tearing out that bad. Obviously going straight across the end grain isn't going to leave a very smooth finish, but it is the bottom of a drawer panel that nobody's really ever going to see. You'll notice a lot of vintage and antique pieces of furniture that were traditionally made will have all kinds of tear out on the bottom of the drawer bottom. And nobody cares. It's totally fine. That said, if you do want to clean it up a little bit later with some sandpaper, that is your prerogative. Getting a little bit closer now. One thing I forgot to do that I like to do in a case like this, especially with walnut, is to trace my marking gauge line with my pencil. Because from the edge, where I'm crouching down like this, that marking gauge line is really easy to see, but standing up in the position that I'm hand planing from, it's not as easy to see. It looks to me like I need to plane more at this edge than this edge. So I'm going to hit that a few more passes. Change my angle a little bit. And all these planing tracks I'm leaving up here, they're going to get erased later when I plane up to this line up here. I'm still taking a pretty thick shaving to try to get close to my lines before I try to finesse the last few passes. Oh, now I'm getting real close. So I'm going to back off my plane blade a little bit, take a little bit thinner shaving, and start skewing it a little bit. Okay, that's a little too thin. There we go. You can see it doesn't make as much noise, leaves a little bit cleaner edge. Right now I'm closer here than I am here, so I'm going to concentrate a few passes down there. It also helps, like I always have a desk lamp down here, pointing straight down the line that I'm planing, so I can watch for these shadow lines here. That raking light really helps you see what you're doing. It's the part where you kind of take thin shavings and take your time. All the hurrying goes on when you're just hogging off material. When you get close to your marking lines like this, that's where you kind of slow it down and take your time. Now I'm just touching the pencil line here, just touching it here, but not enough here in the middle, so I'm going to try to address that. But I'm not quite kissing the gauge line down here yet, so I'm going to focus down there a little more. Here we go, I'm starting to break through right there, and I'm just about right on it. Which is what I was going for this whole time. That is looking pretty good. Everything's going real well so far, so let's flip around to the other side. You know, I was hardly getting any blowout of the fibers on the end there, which makes me feel a little more confident about doing this side where I'm not going to be putting a long grain bevel later without blowing this out too much. We'll see how it goes. And go back to using a thick shaving. Thicker. There we go. One difference between this plane and the jack plane that I might normally use for this operation, at least with smaller drawer bottoms, is that this has a low angle blade in it. And so when I'm cutting across this end grain, it tends to leave a little bit smoother finish than a high angle blade might, or at the very least be easier to push. Now that I've done a pass, I feel a little more confident hogging off a lot of material quickly. See, these are end grain shavings I'm taking here. pretty neat. So they're easy to split. They're nice and thick, papery. The kind of tactile feedback's really nice. My shavings a little bit, take a little bit lighter cut. Start sneaking up on my edges. Oh, I just kissed it right there. This is great that I'm not blowing out this edge, because I've already cut this to length. What I really probably should have done is left the drawer bottom a little bit over long, so when I do blow out the fibers at the end of this cut, that's just going to be sliced away when I rip the extra length off of it later. Something to think about. That is really good. Now we'll set up to do our long grain edge, which my pencil marks right here, so I'm going to turn this 90. And do that edge last, and I don't need my spacer for that because this drawer is a little bit deeper than it is wide. This is going to feel different when I plane it, I'm sure. Yeah, go figure. Looks like I read the grain a little bit incorrectly because there definitely is some tear out going along here. Now, if that is a thing that really matters to you, the way you can address that is to reorient your workpiece in your leg vise on the front like this, but then you're kind of kneeling down and running your hand plane across like that, which is a little awkward and tiring, perhaps fraught with a bit of peril. I'm not so worried about this. Again, it's the drawer bottom. Traditionally, tear out on drawer bottoms has always been completely acceptable. And I might actually tag this with some sandpaper later to make it a little bit less bristly if I apply finish to it, which I think I probably will. You don't have to finish your drawer bottoms either, but I like to. Especially in your long grade edges, that marking gauge line is a little bit harder to see. And rather than just try to angle my plane more or change the skew of my blade, what I do instead is move down and take passes just off this little bit here, and then move my plane back up when it's ready to flatten it out. I find that a much easier approach. And another thing you can watch to see if you're getting close to your gauge lines is to watch this 45-degree angled arris here between this bevel and this bevel. When it points straight from this corner where the pencil line meets that bevel to the corner of the panel, you know you've reached the end of where you can stop planing. Another little tip that you can use to gauge your progress and just plane away without having to stop and look too much. It's pretty plain to see here, again, in this raking light I'm getting from my disc clamp off the end of the bench. My plane feels like it's kind of sticking to the surface a little bit, so I'm going to wax it a little. This is just some paraffin wax I bought at the store. Got a block of like 4 or 5 of these for like $7 10 years ago. I believe the brand is Gulf Wax. I'll try to leave an affiliate link in the description for these from Amazon. If you want to pick up some of that, you can help out the channel at no extra cost to you. And it's the kind of thing, like you see here, that can literally last you a good decade of hand planing with less resistance. This is particularly true of any kind of metal bottom plane, which is what most people use. If you have wooden bottom planes, you don't have to worry about that as much. So now my arris between this corner and this corner has almost reached the end here, and not even close here. So I really need to focus more on this end than that end. Probably would have been better to demonstrate this technique on a lighter colored wood. Probably really hard for you to see what I'm doing right now. But it is what it is. That is pretty damn good. I'm pretty pleased with that. I can live with this. I'm gonna quit while I'm ahead. Okay, I'm gonna try my damnedest to hold this so you can see it, and hopefully the camera will focus. But you can see how there's an arris from this corner to this corner, and that arris is relatively straight. I'll try to get better pictures so you can see it. And so it is at this point of the project where I put myself at risk of being accused of putting perfection over profit. I'm going to be sanding these bevels to kind of smooth them out and remove some of the plane tracks a little bit. It's totally unnecessary. You totally don't need to do this, but this is just how I like to do things. So I'm going to hit this with some 180 and some 220 just to kind of clean this up. There's also that little hint of pencil line, that 5mm pencil line. Actually, it's 0.5mm pencil line around the edges. That needs to go away as well. This will help do that. And so I'm going to go ahead and sand these edges and clean things up a little bit. Like I mentioned earlier, I am going to put some finish on these drawer bottoms. That really rough grain at the end grain where I plane these bevels is liable to make that finish really ugly. So I'm going to go ahead and sand all this. And then we'll do that one last step that I warned you about at the beginning of the video, where I actually get out another hand plane to adjust this edge here to fit into the drawer groove a little bit better. So here's another extra step that's totally unnecessary, but it's a little bit nicer, so I'm going to be doing it. You'll notice that now that I have this panel raised, what I have is a tapered edge that's going to be fit into a non-tapered groove. And as such, it's not going to fit as cleanly as I'd like. If there's any inconsistencies in the thickness of this taper along its length, it's more liable that this drawer bottom is going to rattle in its groove if it's not just perfect. I can sneak up on a more secure fit that is less rattly if I just create a little bit of rabbit on the edge here to fit into the groove. So it's a little bit of a departure from tradition, but it's something that I like to do to help it fit into the drawer groove a little bit better. I'm going to be marking this edge here to match the depth of the grooves in the drawer sides with a marking gauge. And the depth of my groove is just shy of 7 mils, so I have my wheel gauge set to 7 mil already. And let's go ahead and mark that around my edges. And when I do that, I'm not tilting my wheel gauge to match the taper and keeping it square to the edge as best I can. And you'll see why I'm marking this like I am in a moment. All right, so I've marked that edge with a marking gauge. And now I'm going to create a little bit of a rabbit there with my Skew rabbit plane. And I did a video about the Skew rabbit plane where I spoke at length about how finicky the little knicker on this thing can be. It's a total pain in the tuchus. I'm just not a fan of it. So what I do instead is just create a nice deep marking gauge line right at the edge of where the corner of the rabbit plane blade is going to be eventually. And that helps reduce any lift out of the fibers that would ordinarily be caused by not using a knicker. I'm setting my blade just on the inside of that gauge line, and then I'm going to plane away this material between this gauge line and where the drawer groove is going to be. Because the way that I laid out this bevel here to raise the panel, this area here is too thick to fit into my drawer groove anyways. So I do need to remove that material. And you'll notice where I'm cutting and where there's areas showing where that bevel still remains. As soon as that area where that bevel still remains disappears, I am done. And you know, I've done something wonky by tilting my plane a little bit here, left extra material. I can always clean it up with a shoulder plane later, especially if it interferes with fitting into the drawer groove. I'll clean this up a little bit, and in a moment I'll show you how that fits into the drawer groove. But first, I got to rinse and repeat this around all 3 edges. Okay, I've done a couple test fits and removed more material with the rabbit plane until it looks like this. So you can see there's a little bit of a rabbit around the edge of that raised bevel. And at this point, I think I have it fitting pretty good. So let's stick it in here from this awkward angle and see how it goes. Just like that. Let me show you here what it looks like at the back. See that? And that's why I went through the extra effort. So it fits really nicely into that groove. So all I have to do now is put a little notch in here with a screw in it, that leaves enough room for this panel to expand and contract with the seasonal changes in relative humidity. So I'm going to do that last, and then this drawer will be ready to be put on its slides and installed into the piece I'm working on. So this will be a little bonus footage of how I put a little notch in the back of the drawer here. So in order to find the center of the back end of this panel that makes up my drawer bottom, I could just measure it from end to end and divide it by 2, but I always avoid maths as much as possible. So what I use instead is a center finding rule. This rule has a center point from which the measurements originate from end to end. So basically just lay this down on here and find, well, I have the same distance from center to each of these edges of the drawer. And of course this is an imperial. I normally work in metric when I can. I like it better, but there's my little tick mark that makes up center right there. So the thickness of my drawer back is about 15 mil, and the back of this panel projects out about 1 millimeter. So I'm going to go in half of that, which is 8 millimeters. And I'm going to use this T rule again to mark that. So X marks the spot. So that's where my little screw hole is going to go. So I need to go find a screw that I want to use for this. Okay, so I fished around and I think I found a screw that's appropriate for this use. So this is a countersunk flathead traditional brass screw, wood screw, and it's the only one I have in my shop. And given that this is the only drawer in this project that has a traditional bottom like this, it's a good one to use. So let's get it out of here. So I'm going to use the tip of this screw to kind of start my hole a little bit here. And then I went and got some calipers, some dial calipers, to measure the diameter of the screw in between the threads. So that ends up being 7/64. I chucked up a 7/64 drill bit here and put some blue painter's tape on there to act as a depth gauge. And you can see that my screw is just a little bit longer than the tape is on the drill bit. And then I've oriented the drawer bottom such that I'm sighting right down the middle of it, because it is okay if the screw is a little bit wonky this way or this way, but if it's wonky this way or this way, it's liable to kind of come out the side of my drawer back there, which would be terrible. An epic disaster. So I'm going to sight right down this with my drill bit and drill to that depth. I'm going to register the tip of this brad point right where I started my hole, sight down it, and drill to that depth. So I do that with the drawer bottom installed all the way into its groove, so that those holes line up perfectly later on. So what I need to do now is pull my drawer bottom out of here, which isn't always easy, and notch this out. I also need to drill this hole bigger, actually, because the shoulder, as I call it, the smooth part of the screw here, is not that 7/64. It is more like, what is it, 5/32 or something like that? Yeah, 5/32. So I need to make this hole that's in the drawer bottom accommodate the thickness of the screw right here where it's going to pass through. So I'm going to drill that hole bigger with a standard twist drill bit to 5/32 and leave the hole that's in the back of the drawer back alone, because that's matched to the thickness of the screw in between these threads. Hope that makes sense. So now I've chucked up this 5/32 drill bit here, and it's just a standard twist bit. What I like to do is just drop it right on top of the hole there and run it backwards. And that keeps it from tearing out the edges around the hole too much. And now I can put it in forward, make sure I don't drill into my workbench. And now that hole is big enough to accommodate what I call the shoulder of the screw. So now I just need to notch this out. So what I'm going to do is find a square, a marking knife. I'm going to put the square right up to the edge of that hole. So I'm going to put my marking knife right in the edge of the hole, slide my square up to it, and then I'm going to mark that just like this. And then I'm going to come over here and do the same thing on the other side, which requires me to get in front of the camera, so I won't show you that. But I'm going to create a knife line on each side of that hole. Then I'm going to carry those knife lines I made right over the top here. Rest my knife right into that existing knife line, put my square up to it, and draw it across. And I need to do the same thing on the other side. Again, getting in front of the camera, so I won't show you that part. Okay, so I've carried that knife line all the way around to the other side of the board, and if things are going well, those lines should line right up with the edges of the hole on the other side of the board. So now I'm going to cut out this little notch, and in order to facilitate a nice clean start to the cut, I'm going to chisel out a little bit of the material that I'm removing here up to the knife line. And I'll give a place for my saw to rest when I start the saw. So do that on that side and go lefty and do it on the other side as well. Now I can settle my saw right into that. And what I think I'm going to use in a case like this, I've been doing this more and more lately, is not using a Western saw for really fine little cuts like this. What I've been using instead is this little Dazuki from Razor Saw. This one is the S295, so it's got kind of a hybrid tooth geometry that seems to work well for operations like this. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this notch out right down my knife line here to the hole. And if it's not quite what I need it to be, I can always stick a chisel in there and remove some of the extra material. I like to err on the side of undercutting instead of overcutting. Well, how about that? It just occurred to me that I screwed something up, and I did it on camera, no less. So one thing I didn't account for is the fact that this panel not only needs to be able to contract without tugging on that screw, it needs to be able to expand, which means that where I put this drill hole it's not far enough into the panel. It needs to leave room for this panel to contract without hitting that screw. So what I really need to do is, my screw is going to be placed here, but there needs to be a room in the groove behind the screw for that expansion of the panel. So the way I think I'm going to fix that is to grab my marking knife again. What did I do with that? Here it is. I'm going to expand on the marking gauge lines from earlier behind the hole by about 4 or 5 mil or so. Tell me where the center point of my screw needs to be. It needs to fit in between those 2 marking gauge lines. I have to drill a new hole that will allow room for that screw to move in there when the panel expands. And that I'm going to do over at the drill press. Okay, I've drilled my new hole at the drill press, and what I did is I used a 5/32 brad point bit. And the reason I did that is because when you drill a hole very close to another hole, sometimes the drill bit will have a tendency to start bending and following the original hole, which means that you're not drilling a straight hole anymore. I use a brad point, and the little spurs on the brad point help keep the drill bit straight as it's moving through the material. So that's why I did that. You can see there's a tiny bit of material on either side there I'll have to remove with a chisel. And then what I'm going to need to do is to make room for the countersink portion of the screw. What I'm going to do is, leaving my drill press settings where they were, I'm going to stick a countersink in there and make a little countersink around this brad point hole that I made. And then all I have to do is extend that countersink bevel out to the edges at the back here. Okay, so I went and countersunk it, and I wasn't too precious about it. I just wanted to make sure that the head of the screw is either flush or inset a little bit, and ended up a little bit inset. So I just kind of turn it upside down and see that it sinks into the surface just a bit. Now all I have to do is extend the bevels created by this countersink out to the edges there. So the screw has room to kind of slide back and forth across here. So all I have to do to manage that is try to cut straight in with a chisel, like so. And I'm trying to match the angle as best I can and come in perpendicularly from the back edge of the drawer. I'm skewing the blade of the chisel. Oh, and I still have to remove those 2 little bits in there from when I put my brad point bit in. You can see that that bevel has something to slide on now. Just about done. I'm just going to remove that material right there and then drop my drawer bottom back into the drawer, tighten down my screw, and we'll be looking pretty good. There we go. Slide right through there. And we'll slide it in place and screw it in and see how it all buttons up. We'll bag it, tag it, sell it to the butcher at the store. I rub the threads of the screw in a little bit of paste wax. It's just a habit I've always had. Makes screws go in a little bit easier. I always use these Lutz 15-in-1 screwdrivers. These things are freaking awesome. They ratchet in both directions. You can lock them so it doesn't ratchet in either direction. If I can find this, I'll put an affiliate link for these in the description. They're freaking awesome. I think I got 2 of these screwdrivers. I've had them for almost maybe more than a decade now. They're still going strong, so can't recommend these enough. And since I'm close to parallel, I may as well clock this so it's running in the same plane as the back of the drawer. So now you can see how the bevel on either side of that slot matches the countersink of the screw, and there's enough room for that panel to expand and contract at will in both directions. That's how you do that. All right, well, I think that about wraps it up for this video. And as always, I hope you were able to get something out of it. And it was a worthwhile diversion for me getting anything else done in my shop today. So I appreciate you watching, and we'll catch you next time. Now, if you like what you saw here, please hit like and subscribe. It would help me out a lot. Also hit the little bell icon if you want to be notified anytime I release a new video. And if you didn't like what you saw here, keep it to yourself, pal. Or watch one of my other videos. You might like one of those. Thank you for watching.